All right. Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have Boyd Dunleavey. Boyd is a longtime Choose FI listener and member of the FI community, and he's a 2-time blood cancer survivor and 10-time marathon runner who has a message of hope. His story and the perspective, the through line is things that matter. And when Boyd reached out to me with that, it just resonated instantly because that's what we all want to concentrate on, things that matter. And that's what FI enables us. So I'm really, really excited to get into it with Boyd here. Welcome to Choose FI.
You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
Boyd, thank you so much for joining us. I've been really looking forward to this for a while.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this should be great. So I went back and looked at our email correspondence, and you actually wrote in an email to us in December of 2018.
I did.
It was wild. You left a review for the podcast, and you said, we are still a few years away from reaching FI, but so many things that you guys are talking about I have had success with, such as taking our family to Disney on travel points or learning life hacks like how to replace my roof shed. I felt like a loner sometimes trying to figure these things out. You guys have put it to words, and more importantly, it is a community of like-minded people who feel they have so much more to give than being stuck on the hamster wheel. Way to go and keep going. Your friend from Canada. And I just love that. So that was 2018. We're almost 4 years later.
It was. I remember it like it was yesterday, and it wasn't an exaggeration or an embellishment. I just randomly found you guys, and something clicked inside of me that this has been part of my journey since 2011, just trying to make it work. And so, like you said, we'll get it more into the story about cancer and all those other things. But part of the reason why I reached out is some of the choices that we made 20 years ago are bearing fruit today. And that is a good life lesson for anybody.
Yeah, bearing fruit. Isn't that the story of FI? Is making good choices years in advance, knowing that, sure, it's going to benefit you in the short term, right? When we talk about this all the time here, where the benefits of FI really do start accruing from day one, especially that first time somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck has $1,000 saved up. I mean, that is a life changer. But certainly down the road, when you have a significant amount of money, as we've always jokingly called it, FU money, or you're post-FI, or you've reached FI, right? Like those good choices have borne fruit today and in your life. As you said before we started recording, this is chapter 11 in the book for you. This isn't day one. And I'd love to hear, obviously, about those choices and the effect of them.
Right. So I'm going to go back to 2001, 2002, when my wife and I first got married, because what happens back there impacted what happened a decade later when I was diagnosed with cancer. And I can't state that enough, the importance of having your house in order. You know, I mean, there's a story in the Bible about the one man that saves for the future, built his house on a rock versus the other man that built it on the sand. And so anyways, in 2001, my wife and I got married and we lived in Toronto. And I saw that the price of housing was just so cost prohibitive to buy a home. I was reading books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. And, you know, just it had a tremendous impact on my life. And I started Googling, and my wife and I actually packed up and moved from Toronto, Ontario to London, Ontario in 2002. It's about 2 hours away. It was a smaller city. And we bought a home. We actually bought 3 different homes over 6 years. We just leveraged the equity from the one home to the next home. And that put us in a position where we were homeowners, which was quite spectacular. The other thing that we did too, I should clarify, is I started working for a bank in Canada in 2001. And being on the inside working for a bank, I just saw people struggling financially for years. There were so many people that would come into the bank, paycheck to paycheck or getting their check. And then, it was gone within 3 days and you got to make it last 2 weeks or a month. And what troubled me more, to be honest with you, wasn't the people living paycheck to paycheck. It was the middle class that chose to burden themselves with tremendous debt. And we lived in a nice neighborhood in London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours from Detroit. It's kind of halfway between Detroit and Toronto. And the thing that was just mind-boggling to me was people that would come to me for a mortgage refinance. Did you know that some people were carrying a $600 to $700 car payment on one vehicle, but they didn't have one vehicle; they had two vehicles. So they're paying $1,300 a month on their cars. And these are friends. I'm like, guys, that's my mortgage payment on my house. Not quite, but you know what I mean, right?
Right.
And so, anyways, I guess a couple things that happened in 2005, a month before our son was born. I quit my job at the bank and I became a mortgage broker. So talk about having faith, not fear, right? Talk about courage. And you learn life skills when you make these choices, when you step out. And so I quit my job. I had no money saved up. I had a couple $1,000s saved up and I became a mortgage broker. So you got to learn to work very quickly. And so within 6 to 9 months, I had replaced my income working at a bank as an independent mortgage broker. But the biggest thing that had a huge impact on me was in January of 2006, a friend in Toronto said, Boyd, there are mortgage companies that pay residual income, trailer fees, right? Anybody that works in the life insurance business would understand this. So you write a life insurance policy or have a rental property, you get the idea. It can pay for the life of the mortgage. And as I was saying to you off the air, mortgage comes from the French word morgue or mortuary, where the bodies go. And mortgage literally means payable until death. And so, on the one sense, I'm helping people because I really was. I could show somebody how to save $600 to $800 a month by consolidating debt into their mortgage, by getting rid of a car payment. People would, I don't know if they have unsecured credit lines in the US, but in Canada, you can have a $10,000 to $20,000 unsecured credit line, which seems like a great idea, but you're adding an extra payment to everything, right? $10,000, 3%, that's an extra $300 a month. And so when you've got a $20,000 credit line, that's $600 a month. So anyways, you consolidate the $20,000 credit line into your mortgage and you're saving $600 a month because your mortgage payment only goes up $10 to $20 a month because it's a much higher balance. But anyways, so I was a mortgage broker for about 4 years and said, I never want to go back to the bank. But in 2000, I think everybody remembers the stock market crash of 2008. My wife and I were in Chicago, literally when the world banking system almost collapsed. I went on a trip to Chicago, London, Ontario. You can take a train from Port Huron to Chicago. It's really cool. It was cool. It was like a 6-hour train ride. I was there and people were calling me. The world's banking system almost collapsed. That was really troubling. So you didn't have as much to lose, but you saw the implications.
Yeah. Oh, that's for damn sure. And yeah, when you see every decision maker essentially saying like, hey, we need to do something or this is going to come down like a house of cards, and you realize the enormity of a situation. And obviously who would have known the contagion if they didn't act? But on the other side of it, I'm certainly glad the world's financial system didn't collapse at the time. Obviously,
it was like 2 days away from the whole thing collapsing.
Yeah,
I remember being in Canada, and you go to seminars. CMHC is Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is similar to Freddie Mae or Fannie Mac. And they're like, in the U.S., they're lending up to 125% of the value of homes, and I'm like, that can't keep going.
That's
like
not going to end well,
band, right? It's like that can't keep going.
Hey, Boyd, I actually wanted to slow down and ask you a question. So going way back to the beginning of the story, the 2001 Toronto housing, right? So it echoes my own story when my wife and I were getting married and we were looking around. We lived in Long Island, New York, which is a pretty high cost of living area, a suburb of New York City. And we looked around and we said, okay, we're both CPAs. We theoretically could do this. Right? Like there was a chance that if we work real hard, we'll both be senior managers or partners at a big accounting firm and we'll make a lot of money. But, that's a number of years down the road. And in the meantime, this is going to be really difficult, right? We have to spend $400,000.
Right. The quote unquote American dream where you,
right.
You're taking on a massive amount of debt to get a small, dumpy home.
Right. And for what? And
For
I
what?
think like some people look at a situation and say, there has to be a better way. And most people look at a situation like that and don't question it and just think that's life. And I wonder, it's interesting that both of us took the there has to be a better way path. And I'm curious if you've ever reflected on that.
Yeah, I did. There was a book that a friend lent me. I think, I don't know, his name was Ozzy something. Anyways, he was a real estate agent in Vancouver, and he said, you can make a lot of money in real estate if you move to a smaller town that's 2 hours away from the big city. And there were like 5 things that he looked for. 1 was healthcare, because that's a big thing in Canada. 2, education. 3, an industry that was self-sufficient and not tied to the economy of that city back there. 4th was being near a major freeway. And 5th was something like, it has its own entertainment. It can carry its own for whatever, the community stuff, right? And so for us, it's like you said, London, Ontario was a great fit. I'm gonna say something that's really funny. So there's no South Canada, right? Americans I can go from Long Island down to Richmond, Virginia, and go. There's no South Canada.
Doesn't a huge percentage of the population live in like the southernmost portion of Canada?
90-something% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border.
Crazy.
Right, like, I
So you're not moving
I have
south.
family that lives in Edmonton. That's north, and then people go. Anyways, all that to say, it's like you go laterally, you go east, you go west, and also I grew up in Vancouver, and my wife was from Toronto, and so either of those options were just bad choices.
Yeah, I hear you. I do, but yet most people don't think like that, right? Like, why did you have the guts to get up and go? Like, why are most people are stuck in the city that they grew up in or the area that they grew up in? That's what I find, at least. And maybe it's small sample size with the people I know. Obviously, it could be but an anecdote. But people get stuck in what they know and they're afraid to branch out. And I wonder what it was about you and your wife that said, hey, we're going to do this for ourselves, as opposed to, oh, we want to live near family, or, oh, this is the only place we've ever known, or, oh, whatever excuse you could come up with.
Well, the 5 words of a dying church are, we've always done it that way. So I don't know if that's that's a sign of a dying church. We've always done it that way. And I just remember the lunacy of just, I'll come back to Robert Kiyosaki. His second book, Cash Flow Quadrant, had a tremendous impact on my life. And it's basically, if you can't afford it, right, you're living above your means and you're accumulating debt on a monthly basis. And so it was, but it wasn't. I mean, I had gone overseas. I've been to over 20 countries. Denise and I met in Perth, West Australia. She was Canadian. I was a Canadian. We were working with a Christian organization called Youth with a Mission. And so there was always a bit of an adventure in both of us, just taking a leap of faith. But living in Toronto, I just looked and kept looking. And it's funny, I was at a Chapters. It's a bookstore, Barnes and Noble. So,
okay. Yep.
Yeah, I know. Like, Chapters, come on. It was a big bookstore in Canada, and I was literally looking in the finance section for books and ran into a guy that I've never seen before or since who had rental properties in London, Ontario. And I'm like, oh. So I went on the magic Google, and just started looking up and bought the first house. And we leveraged some money from the wedding and a bit of a line of credit. And in Canada, you can buy a first house with 5% down payment. But the first house that we bought was about $130,000. You couldn't buy a dumpy apartment in Toronto in the worst part of the city where you're paying $600 a month in condo fees for $130,000 20 years ago, right? And it's the condo fees. It was always about the cash flow that really sort of grabbed my attention. And we leveraged the one house, and we moved to a second house, and we tried a few things with rental properties. Didn't work out, and I'll leave it with that, because rental properties can be an amazing source of income. It did not work for us, and I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole.
Bad memories, I take it?
Oh, it was a spectacular failure.
Yeah.
My favorite quote is from Winston Churchill. He said, "Success in life is when you go from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm." He's one of my heroes. He was blamed for the failure of the Boer War, which was around the turn of the century. So he was a failed politician for years. Everybody thinks of Churchill, World War II, and the stogie, and we're going to beat those Nazis and all that stuff. But it was his failures in life and his refusal to quit that put him in a position to win all those years later. It's quite spectacular, actually, if you think about it. But anyways, rental properties did not go well, but you can always learn. And so one of my best friends in Toronto had a couple rental properties. I was managing them for him and different things. And so the home that we bought in 2006 in the north end of the city, which is in some cities, that's the good area, or the west end of the city, right? Like there's always the train tracks, the proverbial
Completely arbitrary, right?
The proverbial train tracks. And it was really funny. I remember talking to my neighbors, Pam and Bill, and they were very nice people. And they were, 15, 20 years older than us. And I'm like, did you ever feel A, overwhelmed when you moved into such a nice house? Or B, the other thing was sort of imposter syndrome, where you weren't really sure that you belong there, right? Because you come from a new area, you're in a nice home. And so it takes time to sort of fill the shoes of what you're doing. And the biggest thing for us was to not accumulate more debt, right? And to live within your means. And then, start having kids. We had 3 kids in 6 years. It's kind of a normal thing to do when you're in your 20s or 30s, right? And so in late 2009, my business had dried up. And one of the things that was quite interesting, again, you gotta watch where you're living. So in Canada, a lot of people would rather do their mortgage with one of the big 5 banks than go to a mortgage broker who does all the work for you for free and gets paid by the lender. So I had to be mindful of where I was at. And so I went back to the bank that I had worked for and said, I'm never going back to the bank, right? Never say never, right? Because life always comes right back and says, hey, you got to learn this lesson. And so I went back to the bank that I had worked for 4 years, but I went in a different capacity. I didn't want to be a teller or a banking officer in a local branch. I was rehired as a mobile mortgage specialist. So you can help people online. You can go to their homes. And so for about 1.5 years, I was a mobile mortgage specialist for one of Canada's big 5 banks. I felt at the time, like, what am I doing? I was working harder and making less money, and there's rules with banks and all those other things. But it really was divine providence that I went back to the bank, because in July of 2011, I wasn't feeling well. And we were supposed to go out of town, and my wife's like, you should probably go to the doctor. Well, what I didn't know was that I had blood cancer. I had acute myeloid leukemia. It was out of nowhere. It was sudden. It was totally random and completely shocking, right? Like, I still can feel and think the emotion of, oh my gosh, what the heck is going on? We were supposed to be going out of town. And I remember my doctor calling and saying the blood work that we took from you is abnormal. Your platelets have dropped. Your red blood cell count has gone through the toilet. And there were a couple of markers that were really obvious looking back, like fatigue is a sign of cancer. I thought it was just having 3 kids in 6 years.
Seriously?
Seriously, right? Like fatigue. I was getting nosebleeds, short of breath, bruising. And so anyways, I didn't even go to the doctor. I went to like a walk-in clinic, and he thought it was a virus. So we ordered blood work, and then my doctor got the results, and she was the one that's like, yo, you got to get to the hospital now. And so that was shocking and difficult all at the same time. But because I had gone back to the bank, because I was in a position where I was employed by a bank, that set the stage for us to be able to weather the storm financially, being off work.
So because you were at that bank specifically, or because
I had gone back to a bank and was a commissioned salesperson, but I was an employee.
Gotcha.
Versus being a self-employed individual that was responsible for my own insurance coverage. And again, I've had conversations with people over the years. I met a guy in Alaska. That's an interesting story on a side note. But I said, if I was an American living in the United States, if I had to guess, I'm sure I would have gone through the process of having proper insurance, right? You live where you're living, but you do the things that you got to do. In Canada, we have this sort of okayish socialist healthcare system where, a lot of people are like, oh, that sounds great. Well, most Americans can't fathom paying 50 to 60% tax rate on everything. You couldn't even fathom that. right? And it's not, oh, this is all this, but there's tax on this and income tax and all these things that ties back to why we have universal health care. But anyways, I was admitted to the hospital and was told that it was blood cancer. And after a few months of tests, I was told that it was acute myeloid leukemia, and it was a terminal blood cancer diagnosis in the sense that if I didn't have a stem cell transplant, I'd be dead within the year.
Oh my goodness. So you just living life, go to a walk-in clinic.
Our daughter was born in February, right? We had 2 boys, and then our daughter was born in February 2011. And a few months later, I remember going to a Canada Day thing. Canada Day's on the 1st, Independence Day's on the 4th, right? Not feeling well. I felt something come on me, and it came out of nowhere, right? It was just whatever. And I mean, you can speculate, well, is it the food we were eating? Is there some sort of precursor? Could it have been anger, resentment? Like,
right. And you'll never know, obviously.
This isn't a religious podcast, and we're not going to go down that whatever. But to say that acute means sudden, here's your blood cancer diagnosis, right? So what are you going to do? What are you going to do when it hits the fan? And thank God that we did, because, the employer that I was working for, they were excellent. Insurance companies aren't that great to deal with in Canada. I'm sure that's that much
not
better
here in the US.
Yeah, in the US, it's that much easier to deal with, right? Especially when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah.
It's like, here's your money, no questions asked.
Yeah.
I know,
yeah.
I'm teasing.
That's exactly how it works. But
I've seen the Michael Moore documentaries on healthcare.
Yeah, Boyd, obviously I want to keep going with your story, and clearly that next choice. This is a terminal diagnosis, and where do you go from there? Obviously, how do you complete 10 marathons in the last 10 years with the path to fight, all this stuff. But I wanted to slow down just real quick on, again, it's like that being resilient. It's thinking outside the box. It's there has to be a better way. Even going back to when you said you'd never go back to the bank, right? When you left to be a mortgage broker. But the reality of life is things are constantly changing, and you need to survey the field and see what is the best decision for me at this moment.
Do you guys ever talk about pivoting?
We do.
Right? You got to pivot.
Yeah. You have to pivot.
This isn't some 70s disco move. This is just, you just got to pivot, right? Like, gosh, I got to tell you, Brad, I enjoyed being a slightly overweight mortgage broker. I love that. I loved it. Like looking back, I remember between 2008 and 2010, I loved it, right? I was making a lot of money. Oh, and that's another thing too. When you're making a lot of money, put money away, right? In the Old Testament, Joseph was put in charge of Egypt, and there were 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine. And, what you did during the feast puts you in a position to be prepared for the famine. And so we saved. And, the learning lesson for me after the 2008 stock market crash was I had people that I was working with, financial advisors, right? Surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. And so we invested in the stock market after 2008. And my goodness, that was a great time to invest.
It certainly was.
We didn't freak out and pull out. We put money in.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a strategy for success. And the feast and famine mindset is a strategy for success as well, right? It's if you think, and I've kind of always thought this way, like you don't want to be negative or morbid and like constantly be planning for the worst, obviously. But I think it's just extremely naive to assume that the feast is going to last forever, because it never does in any situation, right? And life happens, like you are not resilient at all if you can't take the most minor of curveballs that life is going to throw at you, because as we say here at Choose a Vi, life is lumpy, right? Like things happen, little things happen, and they aren't true emergencies. They're just life. Over the course of a 10, 20, 50-year period, life is going to be lumpy.
Or as Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Yeah. First contact with the enemy. It's right. Like you have all these sayings.
Like I remember looking back in my 30s, I was going to be a millionaire by the time I was 40. I was going to make it in real estate, and I was going to do all of those things. Right. And then at 37, you get punched in the mouth.
Right. And it's, what do you do from there?
Right. What do you do? What do you do when you get knocked down?
Yeah. So what did you do?
Well, a couple of things. The community rallied. They got behind us, and I cannot stress enough the faith of the Christian community that believed for me. It was an impossible situation. It was an impossible situation. It wasn't like, oh, well, if he does this, it'll be okay. And if he does that, it'll be fine. No, it was people in our church and they believe for us. And when you're in an impossible situation, get around people that have faith when you don't, right? When it comes to I'm not talking just about God or church, but, be around people that believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. And, people were deeply touched, like this 37-year-old dad with 3 kids and a wife that was on maternity leave, right? And so what did we do? We went to Disney.
Nice.
The community rallied, right? They're like, what do you want to do? And we're like, we're going to Disney. I didn't win the Super Bowl. I was just trying not to die. And so we went to Disney, and actually a benevolent friend took me to Israel in late 2011. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And then my cancer relapsed. In February of 2012, the healthcare system in Canada was so overwhelmed with people needing transplants, they didn't have the beds to do the transplant. And the other thing that I should clarify, I was told that I needed an unrelated transplant because when you need a stem cell transplant, they look at the family first, but if your family is not a match, they put it into the random pool of whatever. And so bethematch.org is the US one, onematch.ca is the Canadian one. It's all of the international database. So I remember getting a call around Christmas, hey, they found a donor, but then they didn't move quick enough. And so we're like, hey, you got to do this. You got to do this. And anyways, so my cancer relapsed in February of 2012. I remember crying for a couple of days, and I really felt like the Lord said to me, stop feeling sorry for yourself and get up and go and be around other people that were sick. And so that was the point in my life where I adopted a mindset of being with others and praying for others. And I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of all these amazing stories of miracles that we've seen, but we've seen a lot. And so anyways, within a couple of weeks of that, God supernaturally delivered me of the cancer. I had a vision of Isaiah 53, by his stripes we're healed, and launched the cancer out of me. It was a spectacular moment, but the part that I can't emphasize enough, you have to be in remission to do stem cell transplant. You have to be in remission. There was a young lady about 5 years later, her first name was Erin, that she was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, and the community rallied. Like, they raised $800,000 to send her to Texas. She was a Canadian, to try and get it into remission. They couldn't get it into remission, and she passed. It still bothers me today, that story, because it hits close to home. So to get it into remission twice in 8 months really was miraculous. And I went through all the chemotherapy, all the radiation, right? And so anyways, my wife Googled and found...
It's funny how that's the through line also.
She Googled and found the hospital. She found Hamilton's Hospital, which is near Toronto. The Juravinsky Cancer Center was world-class, and they were taking patients. And so we told the other hospital, we're not going there because your incompetence almost killed me. And I've had to forgive a lot of hospitals. But anyways, I digress. So May 3rd of 2012, I had an unrelated stem cell transplant. That was probably the hardest thing I've been through. I mean, if anybody's seen Wade Wilson's character from Deadpool, how his skin's all whatever, and he looks just like death warmed over. That's pretty much what I look like going through this stem cell transplant. There's also a scene in the X-Men Origins movie Wolverine where he has the adamantium put into his bones. And the person says to him, this is going to be the hardest thing that you're ever going to do. But remember your why and why you're doing this. I'm like, oh my goodness, movies just are resonating in my life. And so like 3 weeks of this, I have like enough chemo and radiation to put down a small horse, right? You're getting infusions and transfusions, and they take out your stem cells and give you somebody else's. And we didn't know who it was. We were told it might be somebody from Europe just because in Germany, people are opted in at 18 where you have to opt out, whereas in America or Canada, you have to opt in at 18. And so they're like, it might be that. And, the other thing too that's quite interesting is males between 18 and 35 make the best potential donors because men statistically, generally, this isn't an overall thing, but generally have 30% larger bone density. And when women have children, their immune system improves, which makes them less likely to be a stem cell donor because like my sister couldn't be my donor. One, she wasn't a match, but three, she also had 3 kids. And so her stem cells were too strong. Anyways, I don't know.
Can we actually slow down real quick? Because you mentioned Be the Match database before.
BeTheMatch.org. BeTheMatch.org.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So just real quick, because that wouldn't that be amazing if something positive came out of this episode where someone signs up for that database? Like, talk me through just real quick. I know this is a sidebar.
It's not a sidebar. Let's talk about the guy that was, let's say he was my stem cell donor. Say he was an I'm going to come back. This is fun. Say he was an 18-year-old who had signed up for the Navy, was in the Navy.
Just hypothetically, right?
Hypothetically, say his name was Nathan, living in Dakota, and his commanding, this is literally what happened. I found this out this year. Okay, so his commanding officer said, you can have a day off if you go down and get your mouth cheeks swabbed, right? They do the cheek swab with the thing, right?
Yeah.
And you just go on the database. To get the phone call to be a donor is like 1 in a million. But for this 18-year-old kid, his incentive that was to get the rest of the day off. There was no needle. There was no blood work. You weren't donating blood, but bethematch.org. And I'm going to put a shout out too, because being a Caucasian male helped a lot. But the tragedy and the thing that really, I've met some amazing people in different ethnic communities. So I'm going to put a call out to the South Asian community. So people from India, Vietnam, China, and also the African American community, where their numbers and odds of finding a donor are tragic because less than 1% or less than 10% of everybody that puts their name in the pool is in those communities. So people that know 18 to 35-year-old males, say that are Vietnamese or African American, please. I mean, it's just a cheek swab. And, there's a lady that I met in Vancouver in 2016. Her story was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how she's going to make it. And I'm going to share this because a young Vietnamese guy in Boston put his name in the pool. Nancy was half Indonesian and half Caucasian in Vancouver and told she needed a stem cell transplant. But somehow that guy saved her life. That's a wild story that we could talk an hour about.
Amazing. So, right, that's the call to action from this episode, is
Yes.
If you're listening to this, bethematch.org, go down. It's a cheek swab.
Go down. And donate blood, right? Because when you're going through the amount of chemotherapy and radiation that I went through, you need blood transfusions just to stay alive. You do. You see silly, I remember in Simpsons episodes back in the 80s of Homer donating blood to get money or whatever, right? And, but donating blood actually keeps people alive. I met a real estate agent in Canada named Marcia who was in a horrible car crash, and it's because people donated blood that she was able to have the transfusions to stay alive.
Yeah, I actually just went down. We have an American Red Cross donation center a couple miles from us and just started giving blood again recently. Yeah. And actually, it's interesting. My blood, unfortunately, is the least valuable donor's blood. So they told me that platelets would be a better option going forward. And I'm going to start doing that. But yeah, I mean, this is something I've jokingly famous about using my Todoist app, like fanatically. And that's something that I literally now put into Todoist on a 8-week rolling basis, go down and give blood, or I guess in my case, platelets.
The platelets are quite fascinating because they recycle it and put it back in, right? And so it's less invasive. And so you're there. Yeah. I can't give blood anymore. I gave blood over 30 times because it was the right thing to do. And I was quite pathetic at it, actually. I would pass out, and I couldn't go with my wife because if I saw her giving blood, I'd get nervous and pass out. And, the best way to break a fear of donating blood is to get blood cancer and have hundreds and hundreds of transfusions. Like, you can't really see the needle marks anymore, but I've had 4 different port lines in my arms. I've had, hundreds and hundreds of needles. So that's but it still makes me nervous, right? I remember I was just at the cancer clinic earlier this year just for a checkup, and I still hate the needle. But anyways, that's to make sure I'm alive. But, the slogan in Canada for the Canadian Blood Services is blood. It's in you to give. So yeah, that's another feel-good takeaway moment.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it's really important. And it's really pretty easy. So yeah, for anybody who's out there is inclined, bethematch.org, American Red Cross is a great option for giving blood. I also wanted to just slow down really quickly on something. I know you talked about, positive thoughts and prayers in the religious sense, but you also said, like, it doesn't have to be religious. Like, and I think this is really important for everybody listening. Is like,
we attract energy that we put out.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, Boyd.
We attract energy that's put out. So, Brad, we could talk for 3 hours. I've learned a lot of life lessons. Why was why was I having these whatever? But I was putting out energy and attracting sort of numbskulls, right? When you have numbskulls in your life, or you use different words,
Yeah.
it's because you're putting out that energy and you're attracting it. And so it's like a magnet, right? Like you attract things to it. So if you're a magnet of positive energy and believing in people and wanting to see other people win and all that stuff, it tends to come back to you. But when you're like, oh, life sucks, and you know, it took me a while to get comfortable having the world's greatest economy and military superpower right next door to me. It did. It did. It's not an automatic thing, right? It's kind of like sharing a bed with an 800-pound elephant. I don't know if there was an article about that, right? Like in the news, like this is a famous Canadian thing, sharing a bed with an 800-pound elephant. You're not always whatever. And then to turn around and have that person save my life, it's given me such a tremendous appreciation for the United States of America. With all its shortcomings and flaws, I really love the fact that we live next door to you guys, geographically.
Yeah,
I really do.
I hear you.
I mean it with all my heart. And so that's part of the reason why I think that, your community is just quite spectacular and amazing, because you're making good choices that tend to bear fruit later.
Yeah, and I think that community is so important. You've talked about it both in your, certainly faith community, the community of people who have rallied around you. We talk about the FI community, and we talk about, again, these positive thoughts. I think like so many of us, and I might be kind of hardwired with like that slight kind of like Eeyore dour personality, like, and I've tried so hard to overcome it, because like not the personality, but like you have a choice to look at a situation in the sense that like, hey, it's one objective truth, but you can either look at it positively or negatively. And it's the story that you tell around that. And it's like, if you have the choice to look at something positively or find the positive in something, that is going to serve you so much better. And it's not delusion. It's not
Right.
delusion at all.
I'm going to resonate with what you're saying, that I'm a reluctant optimist and,
Right.
and I'm a reluctant healthy person. I like being slightly overweight. I like complaining it around the water cooler. I like that. But you're
Right. But does
drinking
it serve you?
toxin and poison into your body. Being dead at 37 wouldn't serve me or my family well.
No, it certainly won't.
It wouldn't serve it well, right? And it is funny that there's definitely moments where I'm not very positive, but it's choosing to not stay in that. And it's choosing to push past that and to be like, yo, right? Like there's a saying that the righteous man falls 7 times, but he gets back up. And getting back up and not being stuck in the mud. And it's really quite interesting or fascinating. And like I said, when I found you guys in 2018, I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are doing the right thing with just putting it out there, because I'm sure some of the people that have come and talk about the rule of 72, right, where money doubles every 7 years and all that stuff. And quite interestingly, I was pretty good with banking and finance, but when you like two of the side effects of going through a year of chemotherapy and radiation were traumatic brain injury and spinal cord trauma, as well as a host of other serious health issues. And so how I can run with those ongoing health issues is quite fascinating. But, on a side note, because of these ongoing health issues, I was allowed to qualify to run the Boston Marathon under the Athletes with Disabilities program. So I'm telling you, Brad, I can get stuck in that moment where I feel sorry for myself. Or I can look at, okay, these are the disabilities that I live with. And in spite of the disabilities, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take what was given to me, right? The story of the 2 frogs in milk, and one drowns and the other one keeps churning until it turns into butter. I took the health issues and used that, right? Like one of the other things I remember reading about years ago was leverage. It's like a rock and a stick, and you leverage the whatever, and leveraging equity and leveraging money.
So, Boyd, obviously, the story is incredibly interesting. And you talked about in this your hypothetical, your stem cell donor, Nathan, who actually is your stem cell donor.
He's my hero.
No surprise there. And yeah, I mean, that, as we talked about, you've run 10 marathons. You're getting set, as we're talking here, to run your 11th in Berlin, which is remarkable. And you said you found the FI community, you found us in 2018.
Right, randomly.
Yeah, just randomly.
So this was interesting. Again, you attract what you put out. So we had these wonderful Greek neighbors that were friends, and they were doing stuff that I couldn't do when it came to having success with income properties and having success with investing in the stock market. And so,
That you couldn't do, Boyd?
well, yeah,
That's an
I'm not
interesting word.
working anymore.
Yeah.
So I can't do
Gotcha.
rental properties. My experience with the rental properties was a disaster. It was a disaster. But I remember just chatting with them. And the other thing, too, was, again, having smarter people around you. We had a very smart financial advisor. We had a very smart accountant. We had people that were helping us with our finances. We did the things, and then we surrounded ourselves with people that were smarter than us. And so they said, oh, we invest our money with the Motley Fool investment services. And I remember thinking I knew what that was, but I didn't know what it was. But I just was like, okay. So I took some of my investments and tried doing it on my own, and it actually went very well. But then they have a podcast, and that's how I stumbled upon you guys in late 2018. And it wasn't an exaggeration or embellishment. Like, some of the things that we had done because of my cancer diagnosis, because of living on a disability, because of living with one income, we had to live below our means. And so, we drove one vehicle, and it was an older van. I remember you talking about I think it was a Bronco or something, right?
My first car?
Yeah, your choice car, your Toyota.
Oh yeah, it was a Honda Civic. It was Golden Boy. It was a little Honda Civic.
Right. But it was a year Jonathan that had an SUV, like an older.
Yeah, Jonathan did. Yep, you're absolutely right.
Right. Yeah. And I knew what you guys were talking about. You're living with this thing, and it's like, yay! I'm not financially free, but yay, because we don't have these car payments. But you're like waiting for this thing to not fall apart, and you're just pushing the miles, and just continuing to live with that thing. But like the 2015 trip to Disney was quite spectacular. We were able to accumulate points that all five of us, we're a family of five, flew to Disney on, I think it was Air Canada's Aeroplan point system. And, like overcoming blood cancer. My first marathon was at Disney. That was in 2015. That was 3.5 years after my terminal cancer diagnosis. I called them up. I'm like, hey, I'm a blood cancer survivor, blah, 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 blah. And a success in life is when you go from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. And like, Boyd, your story's amazing. Would you be willing to share your story? I'm like, okay. Well, I had the pleasure of sharing my story on stage in front of 20,000 people. So that wasn't intimidating at all.
Oh my goodness.
I know. Could you imagine 20,000 people? Oh, and not only that, you're a very polite, helpful host. That moderator kept talking over me the entire time. So anyways, God bless him. We've moved on. But then to run 26.2 miles, even at Disney, it was like, oh my goodness. But there were two things. One thing that was so cool, and it's really neat to think about, the Disney employees don't have to come out at 5:30 in the morning, right? The marathon starts at 5:30 in the morning because the parks are open every day, 365 days a year. Right. They came out to cheer us on. That's quite emotional. And the other thing that was really neat was a friend named Walter from Canada happened to be at Disney for the marathon. Like Disney has 28 hotels that they did at the time, right? And he happened to be, we were both at Port Orleans. And he said, would you like me to guide you during the marathon? And I'm like, oh my goodness.
Wow.
Right? That's like a sports person asking, can they play baseball or basketball with you? That's like Michael Jordan saying, can we do a round of pickup or whatever? And so anyways, that helped so much. And he guided me during the marathon. And at the end, it was quite an emotional experience. He taps me on the shoulder at mile 25. Boyd, you're a marathoner. And I couldn't stop crying. I'm like, shut up. We got a mile to go. And, I'm like, because we kept going back to Disney. We went like 8 times in 9 years during all this. But anyways, January of 2015 was the breakthrough moment, which was my first marathon. And, you finish and there's a lot of emotion and you're crying. And then it's like, wow, that was quite a spectacular moment that I don't want to take away from or overstress. And, I shared on stage on behalf of the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which is a great organization. But, it was a special moment that was just more than cancer. And my uncle coined a phrase that I think is true. Americans love tragedy to triumph stories. They really do. They make movies of it. You go from a tragic situation to triumphing over something, right? That turns out is just as much part of the American dream, because I've had thousands and thousands of people tell me that I have a very special story. And so that was a neat moment. And like I alluded to earlier, going to the Boston Marathon is the event. It's literally the Boston Marathon.
Oh yeah.
It's the Boston
That's the
Marathon.
dream.
It's of the 10 marathons that I've run, I would have to say New York was by far my most favorite marathon by a lot. That was November of 2018. It's just a ton of energy. There's like tens of thousands of police officers out volunteering. I saw this short African American police officer. I'm like, excuse me. I'm yelling at her, officer. She's like, what? I was like, you're amazing. Thank you for being here. And she fell on the floor laughing. Just fell on the ground. She couldn't stop laughing. And so that was just a moment of tremendous excitement and enthusiasm. But anyways, I digress. So Boston, man, it took a long time to get approved. But it's like I said before, I shared with them my health history. I shared with them my disabilities. They didn't say, oh, welcome, just come run the marathon. They asked a lot of questions, like 8 months of this. It was 8 months of a lot of questions. But Boston in 2016 was a really neat year. Reached out to the Red Sox and got to meet John Farrell on the field.
No kidding.
Yeah. And then the Jays were there, right? Did you know that Canada has a baseball team?
I do.
Right. We have one baseball team,
fan,
so we're all Blue Jays fans, right? We're the communal team. But anyways, the Jays were there. And so I got to chat with Buck Martinez and Hazel May, which were sports announcers. And he got me a ball signed. And it was quite a spectacular moment. And the other thing too, I'm just going to say, I brought 4 Americans with me to Boston that year. I did. I just wanted to be around positive people that kind of had a cowboy mindset of, we can do this.
Yeah.
Not all Canadians are amazing and not all Americans are amazing, but I wanted to be around 4 Americans that had we're going to do this and this is going to be an amazing moment, not, because we've all been around people in our lives that say you can't. We've all been around people in our lives like, you can't do that. That's just the rules, right? And then, these were people that I ran with. These were people that were the experts. These were people that I was in their running group. Oh, well, yeah, a 5-hour marathon doesn't qualify for Boston. Traditionally, it doesn't. But if you have this and this with your health history, if you have a traumatic brain injury and are considered an athlete with disabilities, I was allowed 6 hours to qualify.
Wow.
So it turns out I was, qualified like a champ.
Yeah.
So anyways,
Boyd, I love that. I mean, I have to interrupt because
please do.
The positivity, the resilient, there's so many through lines. We talk about at the outset things that matter, right? And these are the things that matter in life. Trying to overcome something, obviously in your case, something dramatic, but even in this micro case, trying to get into the Boston Marathon.
Oh, there was nothing micro about that. I'm gonna push back on that because part of the story that I didn't.
Well,
share,
I mean, micro compared to
No. You're right in the sense, people are like, you'll never get into the Boston Marathon. I'm like, if God can heal me of cancer, I can get into the Boston Marathon. But it was quite interesting. I was in Boston in June of 2011 to see my Vancouver Canucks get absolutely destroyed by the Bruins in the finals. I was there for the hockey game, and I joked with my best pal. This is I could have led with this, right? I joked with my best friend. I said, the only way I'm going back to Boston is to run the marathon. Well, we were slightly overweight mortgage guys. We weren't runners.
Right.
And
that would be
6 weeks later, I get this cancer diagnosis. And so it took 5 years to get back. And so when I went back 5 years, I was talking to police officers in the street that people were just, the best part about that year was I'm at Logan's airport, right? And we all know that TSA agents can be pretty intense. The guys at the airport, right?
It's true.
Yeah. So this TSA agent, he's like, oh, you just ran the Boston Marathon. I'm like, yeah, this is my first time here in 5 years. He's like, oh, what happened? I said, I got blood cancer. And that man started crying. He just started like that. He started crying. I'm like, whoa. This is a bigger story than I could fathom or gather. And so we called a bunch of people. You've never had that experience at the airport where all the TSA agents say, oh, this is Brad from Choose FI.
No.
Right? Like they're just doing their job. They're just doing their job.
That will never happen. That will never happen.
Well, you never know. Don't say never. Never say never, right? And so anyway, so it's like, wow. And then I thought it was a one and done. And I was in Flint, Michigan, the famous Flint, Michigan for a 10-mile race the summer of 2016. And I ran into Bill Rogers, who's like the 4-time Boston Marathon champion. And one New York. It's the only time I didn't have my phone with me out of all the photos I've had with all of these people. And he's like, Boyd, you have an amazing story. And I remember my wife saying to me, you should go back to Boston. And so this is an important moment that I need to talk about. I was given less than 30% chance of living to 5 years, less than a 30% chance of living to 5 years. And so May of 2012, April 17th, 2017 was 5 years later. So what did I do for my 5-year anniversary of my stem cell transplant? I ran the Boston Marathon a second time. Oh, and Catherine Switzer, the first woman to run Boston, remember the lady from New York, right? The famous Catherine Switzer, you can Google her. She wanted to meet with me that year. It was wild. It was wild. We met in a private media room, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so she signed my bed for my daughter and all this stuff, right? And so I had a 25-minute personal best that day at Boston.
25 minutes.
25 at Boston.
Holy cow.
I was the third place
so nearly
athlete.
A minute a mile.
I was the third place athlete with disabilities and the top Canadian in that category. And the one particular individual that said I would never go to Boston, I beat them by a minute that day.
Wow.
Right?
Oh, good for you.
I'm not going to talk about those people because we all have those people. But that guy that said I would never go, I beat them. Never shared about it publicly. I'm sharing about it years later, not naming names. But there were people that said I would never go, and I beat that person at Boston. And so that was quite a fascinating moment. And so that was my punch to the face of my own hopelessness. And it really, the community of people that really like my story has continued to grow. And it's not a political thing, right? Like I've spent a little bit of money seeing, just through Facebook advertising, where does it attract? And it attracts just as much on the right or the left. And so when I say it attracts on the right or the left, my comment to you is we're all human beings. And so the thing that I like about what you guys do, the thing that I like about what Motley Fool does is it's not political. It's just a choice, right? It's a choice to make good choices. And so, it's like you said, I ran 7 marathons in 7 years waiting to meet Nathan. And so my stem cell donor is an American naval serviceman named Nathan. And Nathan was overseas at the time when he got the call to donate his stem cells. This was 5 years later, right? Like he was promised a day off from his commanding officer. And then 5 years later, he gets the call.
So his name was just in the database
his
for
name,
5
Nathan
years.
Barnes. He was it's so random. It's a 1 in a million thing.
Yeah.
It's like that scene from Avengers, the last Avengers, where Ant-Man's trapped in the van and some rat walks across the thing and pushes the button and that's what saves the universe. It's kind of a pathetic reason to put your name in the registry, but at the same time, too, it was totally spectacular. It was a spectacular moment that he had no idea what he was doing. He just had his cheeks swabbed. I think, let's pretend him and his buddy went for the day off. Let's pretend that they were promised a day off, and 5 years later, he's 24 years old. He's deployed overseas. He's in Japan. This is in 2012. And he gets the phone call. He gets a notification that he's eligible to donate his stem cells. Now, God bless the U.S. Navy. They could have just said, yo, this guy's busy. He's not available, right? Yeah, he's a serviceman.
So they fly him back from Japan?
The U.S. Navy paid to fly this guy to Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Right? Like, I actually served in the Canadian Forces and I was an Army guy, but God bless the Navy. Right? Like, this is just wild.
Yeah. I mean, the serendipity, Boyd, that, again, these through lines, right? So like the positivity, the surrounding yourself with communities, the serendipity of your friend, I think it was Walter, being at Disney with you.
Random.
Yeah, it's wild. It's absolutely wild.
A friend in 2013 took me to Alaska and ran a marathon for me with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. That changed my life. I bought a pair of shoes and started running. And a year and a half later at Disney, there was a lady named Bonnie Brooks, who was the national director of the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, who shared the stage with me that day. She remembered me from Alaska a year and a half earlier. There's a lot of weird connections to life.
And it's also, like ripple effects as well. Like think about Nathan, a young kid at that point, just going down, getting his cheek swabbed, saving your life. It impacts obviously your family. It impacts the tens, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people that have heard your story now.
Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have been touched by this story.
Yeah, just from this podcast alone, right?
Right. Like I said about that lady, Nancy, I just saw her on the news. I was out in Vancouver to see my family in 2016. She's alive today because the community rallied. I'm not going to take credit for it, but I was a part of that. Like I shared at my uncle's church, we're looking to help Nancy. There was a lady in the church that knew Nancy. This is in North Vancouver. All these weird connections, right? And so anyways, Nancy's still alive. She's still alive. Those are the miracle stories. I have been to a lot of funerals. I have cried a lot of tears. I don't want anybody in this podcast thinking that I haven't suffered much grief and seen a lot of people that were loved that are not around anymore. Anyways, so it's really quite a miraculous thing to have run all these marathons. I ran Chicago, I ran New York, I ran Boston 3 times because and Disney twice. Some guy said I would never run Boston, but I never met Nathan, right? Because he was deployed overseas. And so for 7 years, we're waiting to meet Nathan. And so I ran 7 marathons in 7 years waiting to meet Nathan. And so where do you think we met Nathan? At Disney. At Disney. You can
Nice.
Google Boyd Dunleavey at Disney, right? There's a video of us meeting at Disney's Animal Kingdom. Everybody's there. And then I ran a half marathon and it gives me a medal at the end. Right? A metaphor for life. It still gives me goosebumps that moment because, we both had to do it together. He had to donate. He had to go through the process and he had to make a second decision. Was he going to do it? Right? And so I did it. I spent a few days with him at Disney just in July of this year in 2022.
Okay.
And he had to decide if he wanted to do it. And so God bless the fact that he didn't have to have where they dig into your hip to draw the marrow out. But you can do a blood transfusion, right? There's different ways that you can do the thing. But anyways, so he went through the whole process and he decided to do it. And then a nurse flew from Canada to Washington, D.C. to get his marrow. They didn't tell me where he was from. You have to wait a year, right? Like a lot of people that receive the stem cell transplant die. And so we connected in 2013. So since 2013, we were hoping to meet. And so we met at the Wine and Dine half marathon weekend. And it was in November of 2019. And it was just a spectacular moment. 7 marathons, 7 years, waiting to meet Nathan.
Yeah.
Right? We were on TV. I gotta tell you, man, it was so cool. One person in California and another person in New York messaged me that day that we saw you on Fox News.
Really?
Yeah. So I knew it was having an impact on a lot of people, right? And then I thought, yay, we're going to do something spectacular with our lives. And then this bizarre virus that nobody heard of hit a few months later.
Yeah. It's had quite an impact, needless to say.
But here's the interesting thing. Again, habits are formed by doing the same thing over and over again. There's a guy that I follow. He calls it stacking habits, and he's an athlete, right? So he's a runner and a trainer. So you stack the habits. So when you get to the day that you don't feel like going for a run, it becomes right. It's 6 weeks to form a habit. So you form habits with financial choices. You form habits with whatever. And so I started running more during COVID because there were no races. And, I dedicated myself to getting a bit healthier, losing 10 pounds, really taking it seriously. And I was watching like a Grant Cardone thing on Facebook Live during spring of 2021 during COVID. And like 3 weeks later, my wife's like, you want to move to the Maritimes, which is like 1,100 miles east of Ontario? And I remember the bracelet WWJD, what would Jesus do in the 90s? And I thought, what would Jonathan do? Or what would Brad do? Or what would Paula Pant do?
Yeah.
Right? And those people that you interviewed the one time that moved from Boston to like Kentucky, right? Is it called a Geo Albatross or something like that?
Yeah, Geo Albatross. Absolutely.
Hey, just get me moved. And so that's what we did. I'm like, yes. And she's like, you don't say yes to anything like that. That's not you. But I just knew that if we rode the wave, like the demand for real estate in Canada during COVID went up exponentially, something like 30 or 40% for the cost of housing. And places like the greater Toronto area just went through the roof, or Vancouver or Montreal. And so we packed up and moved in July of 2021 to Moncton, New Brunswick, which is about 3 hours east of Bangor, Maine, 4 hours east of there.
Oh, wow. Okay. And yeah, that's kind of the part of the story I wanted to get into here at the end. It's, again, another through line has been resilience, right? And obviously financial resilience is a big part of your story that we haven't really talked about. But obviously the last 4 years, you've been following Choosify. You've been making smart financial decisions for a long time. You talked about 2015 using rewards points to go to Disney.
I know. There's no Chase Sapphire program in Canada.
No, and that's actually, to give you a little credit, point is, or a lot of credit, is it's really difficult, frustratingly so, for Canadians to use travel rewards because a lot of the great credit card sign-up bonuses that we take for granted here in the US just aren't available to Canadians. So it's all the more impressive. Like I took my family to Disney World and we put an article together in 2013 on my like original site, Richmond Savers.
Yeah,
and
I know. I remember reading it. I'm like, hey, we did that.
Nice.
We did that. Man. That's why I've been wanting to like talk to you for a couple of years. I'm like, we sort of did that.
And it's amazing. It feels so good. So actually, we did have an episode on that, episode 31. We also have a step-by-step guide to Disney at choosefi.com/Disney to use rewards points. And it just feels remarkable. It just feels, it's similar to Fi in the sense that it feels like winning at life. It's like this little secret
Right.
that, okay, if I can just be a little more optimized, and this is how I view Fi in general. It's like, I don't live a life of deprivation. I don't think I live some crazy life at all in any sense. I'm just a little more optimized, but those small choices compound into something dramatic.
Right. Winning at life. And some of the, like we went 8 times in 9 years. So when we went in 2019, okay, like one of the other choices that we made, which was quite interesting, is we bought the Disney Vacation Club membership in 2012. So we're Disney Vacation Club members. Like when we went in July of this year, we went for a couple of weeks. Well, the hotel cost was on points, right? It's on our Disney Vacation Club membership, and that's not for everybody. And I'm not advocating it, but it kind of worked for us. And so I remember when we went in 2019, they're like, "Oh, that's such an amazing video. Who paid for it?" I'm like, "I paid for it. What are you talking about?" But what I was saying is, we planned that trip in February of 2019, and by the time we got to Disney in late October, we had paid for the trip.
Nice.
We paid for the trip. We saved up, and we didn't have the best experience with, God bless Delta Airlines. Coming home in late 2018, early 2018, there was a bit of a schmalza with baggage. They gave us future flight credits that didn't expire.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, we flew first class, right? Like, like the flight was free, but I'm like, okay, we're gonna pay $200 to fly first class, because right. But we flew on points because of the whatever. And it's okay to communicate when things don't go well. And the thing that I love about Disney is when it doesn't go perfect, they fix it. That's why I go back. But anyways, it's about character and excellence and winning. And it's funny that you say that. And people aren't really comfortable with me talking about winning at life. And you win at life, and to be blessed. And in moving here, we got out of debt. That was a goal of mine years ago, to pay off my house. Right? It's something that I said a decade ago, in the midst of going through cancer, in the midst of living below our means, in the midst of living off of one income, in the midst of finding ways to travel. I said I would like to be out of debt. And for some people, being out of debt is a win. For some people, you leverage the equity in your home and buy investments or buy rental properties. I have no problem with that, because it's not bad debt, right? The difference between good debt and bad debt. And so just coming here in July of last year was just really weird, because it's like all of a sudden the noise just stopped. We were out of debt.
Oh man, that feeling. And I love how you set these intentions years ahead. Like, even as you said, when you were a slightly overweight mortgage broker and you said, I'm going to run the Boston Marathon someday.
Yeah, the only way I'll go back to Boston is to run the marathon. Like, how do you pull that off?
How do you pull that off? And you talk about 10 years ago, hey, I'm going to be debt free someday. And to have that come to fruition from a lot of good choices, a lot of not easy choices, right? Again, like I don't want to overplay it, but like picking up and moving is difficult for a lot of people, right? Like, it may not have been difficult for you. It may not have been as difficult for me, but that is a big choice for a lot of people. So for a lot of people, that is a remarkable thing to be able to do that. So like, don't sell yourself short in that regard, that it might have seemed easy, but it's not for a lot of people.
It wasn't. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's like, you see these motivational things where people like do hard things, right?
Right.
So, the really neat thing was, we get here, and then I realized I can't sit on my...
Took us.
I can't sit on my, I ran 7 marathons in 7 years. Like, what are you doing for me now? And so we got here, and one of the interesting things was that the Maritimes weren't as locked down as the rest of Canada was with COVID. So I ran 2 marathons last fall, a month apart. I'd never done that before. Man, that hurt. It hurts.
Yeah.
And so it set the stage for me to be able to go back to Boston last April, and to have run 10 marathons in 10 years since my life-saving stem cell transplant, including Boston in person 4 times. And the other thing that's really quite fascinating is I've found a community of people that are in the cancer community. And so they're fighting for their lives. And I do Zoom meetings and these types of meetings at least once a week with people that are going through cancer. And I know that my story brings them hope. But I'm telling you, Brad, it's raw and it's painful, because people have died that I've started getting to know, and it's hard. But my point with that is I'm choosing to do it. And so, when I ran Boston this year, I purposely dedicated it to people fighting cancer. It impacted a lot of people. Berlin will be, like I said, 11 marathons since my terminal cancer diagnosis. And September of 2011. And it's also a world major marathon, which is kind of cool. There's 6 world major marathons. And so one of my I have 2 total foo-foo life goals. One is to run the world major marathon circuit. So this would be number 4 or 6. The remaining 2 are London, England, and Tokyo. There's Chicago, Boston, New York, Berlin. And then my other life goal, which is kind of bizarre, is to go to Disney 25 times.
Okay. I like it. Well, you're certainly well on your way.
And I'm pretty sure that was trip number 13, including going twice as a kid. And but
That's awesome.
those things are work. And so being out of debt, it's like what I shared in 2018 was totally true. And here we are 4 years later, we're further along in the story, and but we're still not quite there. And it's kind of one of those things. It's super important, but it's not the most important thing. But it sure helps a lot not carrying debt.
Well, and right. I mean, this Boyd is a path to FI. And that again is what
Right.
we're talking about, right? Like it's not just am I FI or am I not FI, right? It is that entire every step along the way. And like you said, you're on chapter 11 of the book. And who knows how many chapters there are? There could be 200 chapters, right? There's no way to know. And that's the beautiful part is where is this journey going to take you? But all these positive changes and positive choices that you've made have led you here. And like you said, I love that the noise quieted when you paid off that debt.
It was so weird.
That is beautiful.
Because there was a couple of things that we needed to sort out, right? Like it didn't quite go perfectly smoothly, like the advanced funds on a line of credit that we didn't ask them to do and had to. But like when we
but
first
it never
got
goes
here,
perfectly smooth.
But let me reiterate: when we got here, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm running around and I'm all these things, and then by September, it's like, oh, it was quiet. Right, and then focus on running marathons, and we hadn't been to Disney in almost 3 years. So when we went in July, we saved up and we went for like almost 3 weeks. I spent a couple of days with my stem cell donor. That's just wild.
Yeah,
it's weird. It's bizarre. There wasn't anything. Oh, I got to share this story, Brad, because there's 100 of these stories. So we're at Disney, right? We've been there a week. We meet up with Nathan and his wife Kim. He got married last year. And she had 2 little girls and they're blended family. It's beautiful. And so we're at Disney and I'm like, we got to go on the Skyliner, like gondolas, right? So we go on the Skyliner and we take the Skyliner from Epcot to the Hollywood Studios. And then you take one of the boats back. I'm like, it's totally free at Disney, right? It's like so cool. Brad, this is wild. We get off the boat and this family says to me, excuse me, would you take our photo? And there was like 15 of them. And I'm like, okay, because they're like by the water, right? And it was just one of these moments. It was totally weird. I'm like, guys, I got to tell you, that gentleman right there, he's my stem cell donor. He's an American naval serviceman, and he saved my life a decade ago. He's my hero. And they all started weeping. They all started crying. Yeah. I didn't know that they were from New York. They were there to remember their dad that had died of blood cancer.
Oh, my goodness.
He was waiting to have a transplant and died. And then, because of COVID, and they hadn't done the trip, and that was the moment that they were doing the trip, and they happened to cross paths with us. And Kim said something to me, Nathan's wife, that's so true. She goes, that was a God moment. I'm like, it was a God moment, because there's no other way to explain it than it was just sort of whatever. And so I shared my story with them. They're all crying. And they're like, you're a hero. I'm like, no, that guy's the hero. He saved my life. And so they wanted a picture with him.
Amazing. Yeah, talk about serendipity. And that's a goosebump moment. I can promise you that. I've got goosebumps all over. But we could talk for hours.
Probably.
And I would love to have you back on the show.
I'd be thrilled to come back and talk about, how the next marathon chapter went. And I want to say one last thing, because
please.
I know we got to wrap up. This has been a long story, but
it's been a great story. We have no time limits.
It's pretty cool.
That's a nice
I had this mindset that I was only going to run 12 marathons. I set a cap on what I was going to do.
Okay.
Right? Have you ever heard of the term letting go of limiting beliefs?
I have.
All right. So I set a cap. I said I was only going to run 12 marathons. And friends were like, I'm like, marathons are really hard. I love the half marathon distance, by the way. When I met Nathan, it was after a half marathon. I've raced 21 half marathons. I would do half marathons all day long. And I realized when I got out here, let go of limiting beliefs. And so that was the thing that I realized. Like, I was good running Boston 3 times. And then, hey, we're in the marathons. We're not that far from Boston. And so I decided last fall and got involved online with a lot of amazing cancer communities. Like, I do cancer stuff every week. Amazing, wonderful people. Just sharing with them and doing life with people online. And so anyways, I realized 2 things. 1, dedicate it to these people. Don't just do it for yourself because it gives you a drive to do more. But I took the lid off of how many marathons I'm going to run, because who am I to determine, right?
Yeah. Why limit yourself?
Why limit myself? I'm 47. I'm disabled in the sense that I'm medically disabled, but I'm not that disabled that I can't do it again. And so, there's a lot of songs that kind of go through my head, do it for me one more time, or give it to me one more. Like, I know I can do it again, but where I was even 5-6 years ago, getting past the imposter syndrome, getting past my own sort of limiting beliefs, definitely getting away from people that said you can't, and all those things, right? Like the world's your oyster, it really is. So for people that are out there, I think that, being a part of the FI community, implementing a few things, like even that last podcast that you did about the debt relief, that's wild. Like that's life-changing. I promise you it's life-changing, right? For us, paying off a $200,000 mortgage was life-changing.
Yeah, agreed. And that was episode 391. For anybody listening to this as it goes out, there's still time. If you are in the US and you have student loans, please listen to episode 391. It's really, really critically important, and it's time sensitive because there are some waivers that are running out. So yeah, really important. And yeah, boy, this has been fantastic. We talked about things that matter.
Things that matter.
We've talked about the ripple effects of these choices that we make, the lives that we live. And this is for everybody. This is not just for me and you. This is for all of us. And that's the beautiful thing. You never know what the ripple effects will be. And I think a beautiful thing, as we talked about a while back, is maybe the ripple effects of this particular episode are people sign up at bethematch.org. They go maybe for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, and donate blood, right? The American Red Cross.
Active and lose some weight.
Yeah. Right. I mean,
heart disease kills more people than cancer.
Yeah. Go out. You don't have to run a marathon tomorrow.
No. You just go for a walk. Just go for a 30-minute walk.
Walk around the block.
Yeah.
Start there. It literally, we talked about habits, right? We had James Clear on the show years ago. I think it was episode 157, if I remember. Yeah, 157. And I mean, it literally starts from that first step. And I mean, your story is just remarkable. So Boyd, thank you so much for being on the show. If people wanted to reach you, is there a best way for them to get in touch?
Facebook is Boyd Dunleavey. I have a page from Blood Cancer to Boston. My Instagram is From Blood Cancer to the Boston Marathon.
Okay, amazing. We will link that in the show notes to this episode.
You can Google me. Yeah, and I would love to, I can't chat with everybody all the time, but, people that need some hope, that's sort of my whatever. And, if there are people going through cancer and want to find out about different cancer things, I can share about that too with you later, and I can email it to you. But there's tremendous cancer support out there. Again, our takeaway today is community, community, community.
Totally agreed. So, right, we will have that in the show notes. So for anybody listening to this podcast and don't know how to find show notes, generally on any podcast player, there will be a little option to click on this particular episode and read show notes. The links would be right there on your phone. Or you can always, whenever you're listening to a Choose FI episode, you can go to choosefi.com/ and then the episode number. So this is 394. So choosefi.com/394. It'll redirect you specifically to the show notes page for this episode. And you'll see all the links that we talked about, bethematch.org, from blood cancer to Boston, all this stuff, ways to get in touch with Boyd. So Boyd, thank you again. This has been remarkable. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.